I'll give you my Lambo. If you can translate this, mocked the Millionaire CEO to the cleaning lady. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The world of Aethelred Technologies was built of glass and light, a cathedral of innovation, where the gods were algorithms, and the prayers were coded in Python. To Elena, who moved through its hallowed halls after the sun had set, it was simply a place of profound silence, a silence broken only by the whisper of her supply cart and the rhythmic swipe of her cloth against sterile surfaces. She was a ghost in this machine, a necessary but unseen function, who erased the day's smudges and prepared the empty stage for the next day's performance. In her invisibility, she found a strange, quiet peace. She polished the long obsidian conference table until it reflected the city lights like a dark, still lake. And in its depths, she saw not the tired face of a cleaning lady, but the memory of a younger woman. A woman who once studied the etymology of forgotten words in the dusty libraries of Tbilisi. That woman, a historian with a passion for the obscure dialects of the Caucasus Mountains, seemed like a character from a different life. A dream she had once had. Here, her hands, which had once delicately turned the brittle pages of ancient manuscripts, were now calloused from wringing mops and gripping spray bottles. Her profound knowledge of dead and dying languages was a treasure locked in a vault no one knew existed. She had learned to be content with the quiet dignity of her work, finding a kind of zen in the simple act of bringing order to chaos. But lately, the silence of the top floor had been different. It was a tense, charged silence, heavy with the ambition and frustration of one man, Julian Croft, the company's celebrated, feared, and ferociously driven CEO. He and his inner circle had been keeping late hours, their hushed but agitated conversations echoing in the empty corridors. Elena, polishing a glass wall nearby, would hear fragments about a deal, a make-or-break partnership with an enigmatic genius, a recluse known only as Silas, who held the key to a revolutionary new energy source. The deal was worth billions, the kind of money that could reshape markets, but it was stalled. And as the days turned into a week, the frustration radiating from the CEO's office began to feel like a physical force, a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. Julian Croft was a man who believed the world was a problem that could be solved with enough force, money, and will. He saw everything as a negotiation to be won, a system to be hacked. The concept of an unsolvable problem was, to him, a personal affront. This deal with Silas was the ultimate test of his philosophy, and he was failing. The issue was not financial terms or legal frameworks, it was communication. The elusive Silas, a man who had never been seen, communicated exclusively through cryptic messages sent from an untraceable server. And these messages were written in a language that had stumped the world's best minds. Croft had spared no expense. He had flown in top linguists from Oxford, cryptographers from the NSA, and cultural anthropologists who specialized in lost civilizations. They would gather around the massive screen in the conference room, staring at the strange, elegant script. It was a beautiful alphabet, full of sharp angles and graceful curves, like constellations trapped on a page. But it was impenetrable. The experts argued, theorized, and ultimately admitted defeat. They called it a hoax, a cipher without a key, a fabrication designed to mock them. Croft, paying them exorbitant fees for their failure, grew more and more enraged. One evening, as Elena was cleaning the exterior of the conference room, the door was left ajar. She caught a glimpse of the screen, of the mysterious text that was the source of all this corporate agony. Her heart stopped. Her hand, midway through wiping a smudge, froze in the air. The world around her dissolved. The glass walls, the city lights, the hum of the building's climate control, it all vanished. She was standing on a mountain path in Svaneti, the high peaks of the Caucasus, scraping the sky, the air thin and cold. She was hearing her grandfather's voice, telling her stories by the fire, teaching her the words of their ancestors. The script on the screen was no cipher, it was no hoax, it was Svan, a language older than the stones of the watchtowers it was spoken in, a dying tongue used by a few thousand people in the remote Georgian province she called home. It was the language of her childhood, the secret language of her heart. A wave of dizziness and a profound, aching homesickness washed over her. She quickly looked away, her face a neutral mask once more, and continued her work, the greatest secret in the building now resting safely behind her quiet eyes. The pressure on Julian Croft was becoming immense. The board was getting nervous, and whispers of his failure were beginning to circulate. Silas was not just a potential partner, he was a legend, and securing his technology would cement Croft's legacy. To fail now, so publicly, was unthinkable. The deal was on the verge of collapsing entirely when the final message from Silas arrived. It was longer than the others, a full paragraph of the inscrutable text. Attached was a simple two-word note in English: final consideration. It was an ultimatum. Decipher this, or the conversation was over forever. That night the atmosphere on the top floor was toxic. Croft had been pacing the length of the conference room for hours like a caged tiger. His tie was loosened, his expensive shirt rumpled. He had yelled at his executives, belittled his failed experts, and thrown a tablet against the wall. He was a man cornered by the one thing his power could not conquer: the unknown. Elena moved through the outer offices with her usual quiet efficiency, a small island of calm in a sea of anxiety. She could hear his voice, raw with fury, through the thick glass walls. He was a man unraveling, stripped of his usual veneer of invincible control, and the sight elicited not fear in her, but a strange, distant pity. She saw a man drowning in his own arrogance, unable to ask for a life raft because he didn't believe the water could ever be deeper than he was tall. She emptied the wastebaskets, replaced the liners, and listened to the muffled sounds of a modern king raging against the dying of his deal. The moment she had been dreading, and in a strange way, anticipating, was drawing near. She had a choice to make. She could remain invisible, as she had for years. She could let him fail, let this small mystery of her homeland remain intact, her secret safe, or she could step out of the shadows. The thought was terrifying. It meant exposing herself, inviting scrutiny, and crossing a social barrier that was as solid and clear as the glass walls she polished every night. To speak would be to shatter the comfortable anonymity that had become her shield, but to remain silent felt like a betrayal of her grandfather, of the history she carried within her, of the very words that were currently being treated as a nonsensical puzzle. The breaking point came with a roar of pure frustration. "Useless, all of you," Croft bellowed, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. He stormed out of the conference room, his team trailing behind him like frightened sheep. He marched into the large, open-plan atrium, the heart of the top floor. "You want to see what's costing us billions? You want to see the gibberish that has our entire company on its knees?" With a few furious taps on his phone, he projected the final message from Silas onto the massive wall-sized media screen in the center of the atrium, a screen usually reserved for celebrating corporate triumphs. The elegant, ancient Svanscript filled the space, towering over them all. The executives stared at it, their faces grim. Elena, who had been wiping down a nearby reception desk, stopped, her back to the scene. She couldn't help but look at the reflection in the polished black marble in front of her. The words were a poem, a lament for a lost way of seeing the world. Croft's eyes, scanning the room for any target for his rage, landed on her. He saw her stillness, saw the way she was looking at the reflection of the screen. A cruel, mocking sneer twisted his lips. It was the last, desperate act of a man who needed to feel powerful, even if it meant punching down. "What's the matter?" he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. The entire team turned to look at Elena, who slowly straightened up, her heart pounding. "You got something to add? Don't tell me you can read this ancient alien language." A few of his sycophants chuckled nervously. Croft, feeding on their reaction, took a step closer, his voice booming in the quiet space. "Tell you what," he declared, a wild, reckless look in his eyes. "I'll give you my Lambo, the yellow one, parked downstairs. I'll give you the keys right now if you can translate even one word of that." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Go on, the floor is yours." He gestured grandly at the screen. "Enlighten us." The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye was on Elena. She felt the weight of their collective gaze, a mixture of pity, amusement, and disdain. They saw a cleaning lady, a nobody, a prop in their CEO's theatrical meltdown. For a moment she wanted to shrink back into her invisibility, to murmur an apology and disappear. The years of being overlooked, of being a ghost, had taught her that silence was safety. But then she looked at the words on the screen again. They were not gibberish. They were the poetry of her ancestors. They held wisdom and beauty. And this man, this arrogant, powerful man, was using them as a punchline. He was mocking her history, her heritage, the memory of her grandfather's voice. A quiet, steady fire ignited in her chest, burning away the fear. It was the fire of integrity. She owed it to those words, and to herself, not to let this stand. She turned around slowly, her movements deliberate, and faced Julian Croft. She did not look at his expensive suit or his angry face. She looked him directly in the eye. Her own face was calm, her expression unreadable. She took a small, steadying breath, the air filling her lungs with a courage she hadn't felt in years. Then she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was perfectly clear, cutting through the heavy silence with startling precision. She didn't speak in English. She spoke in the rich, guttural tones of Svan, the words of the poem on the screen. Then she translated the first line into English, her voice remaining level and calm. "The mountain does not laugh at the river for beginning as a small stream," she said. The mocking smile on Julian Croft's face froze, then collapsed. The nervous chuckles from his team died in their throats. The air in the atrium seemed to crackle, the entire atmosphere shifting in an instant. The executives stared, their jaws slack, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. They were looking at Elena, but they were no longer seeing a cleaner. They were seeing an impossibility, a ghost who had just spoken with the voice of a sage. Julian Croft stared at Elena, as if she had just levitated. The cocksure arrogance drained from his face, replaced by a wave of raw, unadulterated shock. His mind, so quick and decisive, was short-circuiting. The world, which had always operated on a set of rules he understood and mastered, had just been turned upside down. The cleaner, the invisible woman who polished his desk, he had thrown out the most absurd challenge he could think of, a hyperbole meant to humiliate, and she had met it. He felt a flush of heat creep up his neck, the sting of a profound and public humiliation, but beneath that something else was stirring, a spark of pure, unadorned awe. He looked from her calm, steady face to the words on the screen, and then back again. "How?" he whispered, the single word a surrender. "My grandmother used to say," Elena continued, her voice even, as if she were discussing the weather, "that wisdom is not a palace you enter, but a forest you grow." She had translated the second line, her eyes never leaving his. She was no longer just translating words, she was delivering a lesson that was clearly intended for him. The rest of his team remained frozen, a tableau of disbelief. They were witnesses to a power shift, so fundamental, it felt like a law of physics had been violated. Their leader, the titan of their industry, had been silenced and schooled by the cleaning lady. Croft finally broke his paralysis. He took a step forward, his expression now one of intense, desperate curiosity. The mockery was gone, replaced by the focused gaze of a man who recognizes he is in the presence of something far beyond his comprehension. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low, stripped of all its usual bluster. "My name is Elena," she replied simply. She then turned her head slightly and looked at the stunned executives. "And I would like to accept his offer." She gestured toward the parking garage. I believe he mentioned a yellow Lamborghini. A dead silence. Then, one of the younger executives, unable to contain himself, let out a sound that was half a gasp, half a laugh, before quickly stifling it. Julian Croft didn't even notice. He was still staring at Elena, a million questions igniting in his mind. The multi-billion-dollar deal was suddenly the second most interesting problem in the room. "Dismissed," Croft said, his voice quiet but absolute. He didn't turn to look at his team. His entire world had narrowed to the woman standing before him. The executives, grateful for the escape, practically fled, their hushed whispers echoing as they retreated. In moments, the vast atrium was empty, save for Julian Croft and Elena. The giant screen still glowed with the Svan text, a silent testament to the evening's impossible turn of events. "The car is yours," Croft said, his voice still holding a note of disbelief. He pulled the key fob from his pocket and placed it on the marble reception desk between them. The small black object with its prancing bull logo seemed absurdly out of place. Elena looked at the key, but made no move to take it. The car was never the point. "That poem," Croft said, gesturing to the screen. "There's more. It wasn't a question. It's a Lyle," Elena explained, her voice softening as she used the Svan term. "A song for the sun, but also a test of character." She finally looked away from him and back at the words, her expression growing distant, as if she were looking back through time. "My grandfather was a historian, a keeper of our traditions, our language. Svan is fading. It survives mostly in these old songs and stories. He taught me to read them, to understand that the words are only the vessel. The real meaning is in the silence between them." Croft listened, completely captivated. He was beginning to understand. Silas, the eccentric genius, wasn't just using a rare language, he was using a philosophy. This wasn't a cipher to be broken, it was a worldview to be understood. For weeks he had been trying to kick down a door that was never locked. He just needed the right person to show him how to turn the handle. "What does it say?" he asked, his tone now that of a student, not a master of the universe. "All of it." Elena walked closer to the screen, her finger tracing the air just below the glowing letters. She began to translate, her voice a quiet, melodic cadence. The poem spoke of the interconnectedness of things, of the folly of the peak that thinks itself separate from the valley, of the strength in roots that no one sees. It was a long and complex metaphor for partnership, a rebuke of arrogance, and a celebration of humility. As she spoke, Croft saw the deal in a completely new light. He had been approaching Silas with a proposal of acquisition, of dominance. He had offered power and money, but Silas was asking for respect and understanding. The translation took nearly an hour. Elena did not just give a literal, word-for-word account. She explained the cultural context, the historical resonance of certain phrases, the layered meanings that a simple dictionary could never provide. She was not just a translator, she was an interpreter, a bridge between two worlds. She explained that the final lines were a riddle. It asked, "What is the strongest thing that can be built, which has no walls and no roof?" Croft, the relentless builder of a corporate empire, was silent. He thought of his glass tower, his market dominance, his fortified legal agreements. All walls, all roofs. Elena watched him think, giving him the space to find the answer himself. The frustration on his face was replaced by a look of deep, focused contemplation. He was no longer trying to conquer the problem. He was trying to understand it. "A partnership," he said finally, his voice soft with dawning realization. "No, stronger," Elena corrected gently. "Trust." The word landed in the space between them with a profound weight. Trust. It was the one thing he had not offered. It was the one thing he rarely gave. In his world, trust was a liability, a vulnerability to be mitigated. But in the world of Silas, the world described in this ancient poem, trust was the foundation of everything. The solution was so simple, so elegant, and so utterly alien to his way of thinking. He felt a wave of something he hadn't experienced since he was a young man starting his first company. Humility. He had been so blind. "Help me," he said. It was the two most difficult words for him to utter, and they came out as a quiet plea. "Help me answer him." Elena nodded. Together, they began to draft a reply. Not in Svan, but in English. But this time, the language was different. The aggressive transactional jargon was gone. In its place were words that spoke of shared vision, of mutual respect, of building something together that was based not on contracts, but on a foundation of trust. Elena guided him, suggesting phrases that captured the spirit of the Lyle. It was a negotiation unlike any he had ever been a part of. He wasn't trying to win, he was trying to connect. With the carefully crafted reply sent, a new kind of silence fell between them. It was not tense or awkward, but comfortable, reflective. They were two people from impossibly different worlds who had found a strange and unexpected common ground. Croft looked at Elena, at her simple uniform, and her calm, intelligent face, and saw the embodiment of a lesson he had desperately needed to learn. He saw the immense, hidden value that he, in his arrogance, had been blind to every single day. The world was full of people like Elena, repositories of unique knowledge and quiet wisdom, hidden in plain sight. He had been so focused on finding experts with the right resumes and pedigrees that he had completely missed the true genius who was cleaning his office. The reply from Silas came less than 5 minutes later. It was, once again, in English. It was a single sentence. "A man who learns to listen to the mountain is a man I can build with." That was it. The deal was on. Billions of dollars, the future of his company, the validation of his entire career, had been secured not by his aggression or his army of experts, but by his finally having the humility to listen to the quietest person in the room. A slow, genuine smile spread across Julian Croft's face, the first real smile Elena had ever seen from him. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a gratitude and respect that was so profound it was startling. "The car is just a car," he said. "It's an inadequate thank you. What you've done tonight, you haven't just saved a deal. You've taught me something I should have known a long time ago." He paused, the gears of his mind clearly turning, formulating a new kind of proposal. Athil-Red Technologies has departments for finance, engineering, marketing, everything you can imagine. But we don't have a department for wisdom. We don't have a way to understand the things that can't be quantified. He looked at her directly. I want you to build one. A new division. Cultural and linguistic strategy. A department dedicated to understanding the human element, behind the code, the history behind the innovation. I want you to run it. Elena looked at him, her mind struggling to comprehend the scale of what he was offering. Head a department? Build a new division. It was a dream so far beyond the scope of her quiet life that it felt like a fantasy. She thought of her small apartment, her modest life, the years of feeling like her best self was a memory. And now this, an opportunity, not just to reclaim her past, but to build a future she had never dared to imagine. She looked down at her hands, the hands of a cleaner, and then back at Croft. She saw not a boss offering a job, but a man offering her a chance to be who she truly was. There was no hesitation, just a quiet, profound sense of things falling into their rightful place. I accept, she said, her voice steady. The resolution was not a grand dramatic scene, but a series of quiet, powerful transformations. The first was the Lamborghini. The next morning, Elena walked down to the executive garage, the key fob in her hand. She stood before the ridiculous, beautiful, bright yellow car. She unlocked it, sat in the driver's seat, and smelled the rich leather. Then she got out, locked it, and left the key with the garage attendant with a note. Sell this and start a scholarship fund for foreign language students. Her journey wasn't about acquiring the symbols of wealth. It was about reclaiming the value of her knowledge. Her true reward was the office she moved into on the top floor, not far from Croft's. It started small, just her and a desk, but it grew quickly. She began to build her department, hiring other invisible people. A night watchman who was a published poet in his home country, a cafeteria worker with a degree in philosophy, a driver who was an expert in geopolitics. She sought out the quiet wisdom that existed all around them, hidden in plain sight. The impact on the company was transformative. Her department became known as the soul of Ethelred, providing insights that data analytics could never find. They solved communication impasses, fostered genuine international partnerships, and reminded a tech giant that its greatest asset was not its code, but its people. And in this story, we find a lesson for us all. We live in a world that rushes to judge, to categorize, to place people in boxes based on their clothes, their jobs, their accents. We create hierarchies that blind us to the incredible wealth of talent and wisdom that surrounds us. We mistake silence for ignorance, and a humble station for a lack of worth. But what if we paused? What if we looked past the uniform and saw the person? What if we had the humility to believe that the person mopping the floor might understand the world in a way we never could? True genius is not loud. True value is not always visible. It is often quiet, hidden, waiting patiently for someone with the wisdom to listen. The greatest discoveries are not always in distant stars or complex algorithms, but in the heart and mind of the person standing right next to us, if only we have the grace to see them. The confrontation drained all the fight out of them. Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled not with remorse, but with the hollow look of someone whose calculations had all been proven wrong. Tom just stared at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. There was no grand apology, no sudden realization of their cruelty. There was only the quiet, pathetic fizzle of their greed being extinguished. Carol Martinez, ever the professional, gently but firmly escorted them to the door. I think it's time for you to collect your boxes and leave, she said. They went without another word, a pair of defeated conspirators, their grand heist foiled. They loaded their things into their SUV in a tense, furious silence and drove away. I didn't watch them go. I turned my attention back to the prospective buyers. I do apologize for the interruption, I said to the young couple, who looked like they'd just been through a war. Would you like to continue the tour? To their credit, and perhaps out of sheer morbid curiosity, they did, and they ended up loving the house. They made an offer that very evening, for $10,000 over the asking price. It was a clean offer, no contingencies. I accepted it immediately. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity that felt like the final, efficient stages of a long-planned project. David Chen handled the legal side, fielding a single desperate call from a lawyer Sarah had hired. David calmly informed him of the evidence I possessed, the recordings, the brochure, the notarized revocation of the power of attorney. He explained that any attempt to contest the sale, or my competency, would result in that evidence becoming part of a public court record. The lawyer, presumably after a panicked conversation with Sarah, never called back. While the sale was in escrow, I focused on my own exit strategy. I was not going to a golden sunset meadows. I was going to a place of my own choosing. I found a modern 2-bedroom condo in a new development on the other side of town. It had a gym, a pool, and a view of the river, not a parking lot. It was clean, secure, and entirely my own. It was a place for living, not a place for waiting to die. I hired movers to transport the few pieces of furniture I wanted to keep, and the boxes of Helen's things and our family photos, which I would go through on my own time. Everything else, the heavy dining set Sarah had coveted, the massive sectional sofa Tom loved to lounge on, was sold in an estate sale. The proceeds I donated to the engineering scholarship fund I had established. It felt like a cleansing. Every object they had mentally claimed for themselves was converted into a force for good, for building something new. I signed the final closing documents at David's office. He handed me the check from the sale, a staggering amount of money that represented 40 years of hard work, smart investments, and careful stewardship. It felt less like a windfall and more like a reclamation. It was the physical manifestation of my independence. "So what's next for you, Arthur?" David asked as he walked me out. "A project manager is never without a project," I said with a smile. "My first one is to learn how to use the ridiculously complicated espresso machine that came with my new condo. After that, I'm thinking of taking a trip. There's a famous bridge in France, the Millau Viaduct. I've always wanted to see it." He shook my hand. "You've earned it," he said. "You really have." I never heard from Sarah or Tom directly again. I heard through the grapevine, the way you always do in a family, even a fractured one, that they had been forced to rent a small apartment in a less than desirable part of town. Their plan had been predicated on a massive, immediate infusion of cash from my assets. Without it, their own finances, which I now suspect were a house of cards, had collapsed. There was a certain situational irony to it that I couldn't help but appreciate. They had tried to make me homeless, only to find themselves scrambling for a roof over their own heads. Their underestimation of me was their undoing. They saw an old man, a relic to be managed. They failed to see the engineer, the planner, the man who spent a lifetime ensuring his structures could withstand the greatest of pressures. Moving into my new condo was like taking the first breath of clean air after being in a stuffy, contaminated room for far too long. The space was smaller, yes, but it felt infinitely larger. It was unburdened by the weight of toxic expectations and the ghosts of a relationship that had soured beyond recognition. The walls were bare, the rooms echoed slightly, and it was the most peaceful sound I had ever heard. This was a blank slate, a new schematic waiting for a design. I spent the first week methodically setting up my new life. I unpacked my books, arranging my old engineering texts on a new modern shelf. They looked less like relics, and more like the foundational knowledge upon which my new life was being built. I put up a few pictures, one of Helen and me on our wedding day, another of the Harrison Bridge at sunset, its steel girders silhouetted against the sky. I left the pictures of Sarah as a child in a box. I wasn't ready to look at them yet, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. The espresso machine was, as predicted, a complex piece of German engineering. But I downloaded the manual, read it twice, and by the third day, I was making a perfect cappuccino. It was a small, silly victory, but it mattered. It was proof that I was still capable of learning, of mastering new systems. I established a new routine. Mornings were for the gym downstairs, or a long walk along the river. Afternoons were for reading, for managing my now consolidated investments online, and for planning my trip to France. I felt my mind, which had been dulled by the oppressive atmosphere of the old house, sharpening again. I was engaged, I was active, I was the sole director of my own life. There was no one to question my decisions, no one to sigh with manufactured concern if I decided to have a glass of whiskey in the evening. There was only freedom. I did have one visitor from my old life. My cousin Mark, who had always been more of a brother to me, came by. He had heard the story in bits and pieces and wanted to hear it from me. I told him everything, from the brochure to the sale. He listened, shaking his head slowly. "I never liked the way she treated you after Helen passed," he said. "Like you were a piece of furniture that came with the house." His validation was comforting. "But selling the place, Arthur, that was a master stroke." "It wasn't about revenge, Mark," I said, and I was surprised to find I meant it. It was about survival. It was a controlled demolition. I had to clear the site before I could build something new. He understood. We sat on my new balcony, looking out at the river as boats slid by. The conversation was easy, comfortable. It was a reminder that while one crucial family bond had been irrevocably broken, others remained. The scholarship fund was another source of quiet satisfaction. I received a letter from the university's foundation, formally thanking me for the endowment. They told me the first Helen and Arthur Jennings Engineering Scholarship would be awarded in the fall semester. The idea of my money, the money Sarah and Tom had tried to steal to fund a life of leisure, instead being used to help a bright, hard-working student build a future in a field I loved, was a form of justice far more profound than any personal victory. It was a legacy of construction over destruction. I finally felt detached enough to deal with the last box of memories. I went through the photos of Sarah. There she was, on my shoulders at a picnic, holding my hand on her first day of school, beaming in her graduation gown. I felt a pang of loss, not for the woman she had become, but for the daughter she used to be. I saw now that the cracks in our foundation had been there for years, small fissures of entitlement and a lack of genuine empathy I had chosen to ignore, papering them over with a father's love. It was a painful lesson in structural analysis. I packed the photos away again, but this time, it wasn't with anger. It was with a sense of closure, of acknowledging a part of my life that was over. The design had been flawed. The structure had failed. It was time to move on. The trip to France was the capstone on my new life's foundation. Standing on an overlook, gazing at the Millau Viaduct as it soared over the Tarn Valley, was a profoundly moving experience. It was a marvel of modern engineering, elegant, impossibly light, yet strong enough to withstand the fierce winds of the region. It was a testament to what humanity could achieve with vision, precision, and an unwavering respect for the laws of physics. It represented everything I had ever valued in my professional life. It was a bridge. It connected 2 points, spanning a vast emptiness, making a journey possible that was once daunting. In a way, I had built my own bridge over the last few months. I had spanned the chasm of betrayal and grief to get to a new, stable place. I spent 2 weeks exploring the French countryside, enjoying the food, the wine, and the anonymity. I was just another tourist, a man with a camera and a guidebook. No one knew me as the father who was nearly cast aside, the old man who outsmarted his greedy daughter. I was just Arthur. It was a liberating feeling. The quiet confidence I had rediscovered during the execution of my plan solidified into a deep and abiding sense of peace. When I returned to my condo, it felt like coming home. The sterile newness had been replaced by the comfortable patina of my own presence. I had made it mine. I received another letter from the university. They had selected the first recipient of the Jennings Scholarship, a young woman from a small town who was the first in her family to attend college. They included a short biography. Her essay was about her fascination with how Roman aqueducts were built, and how she wanted to design infrastructure for developing nations. I read it and felt a connection to her, this stranger I would likely never meet. My legacy was secure. It was in her future, not in a house full of resentful memories. One afternoon, a few months later, I was walking by the river when I saw a familiar SUV drive past. Sarah was at the wheel, Tom in the passenger seat. They didn't see me. They both looked tired, worn down. The sheen of arrogance was gone, replaced by the dull finish of disappointment. I felt nothing, no anger, no satisfaction, not even pity. It was like watching a car I used to own drive by with a new owner. It was a part of my past, and it no longer had any power over me. They had become irrelevant to my life, and that was the ultimate victory. My life now is quiet, but it is not small. It is filled with purpose of my own making. I manage my investments. I volunteer twice a week at the local library's adult literacy program, and I am planning my next trip, this time to see the aqueducts in Spain. I have friends, I have my health, and I have my freedom. I learned a hard lesson in the most personal way imaginable, that the most important structures we build are not made of steel and concrete, but of trust and integrity. And when the foundation of trust is destroyed, you cannot patch it. You must have the courage to condemn the old structure, clear the site completely, and start building anew on solid ground. My name is Arthur Jennings. I am 69 years old, and for the first time in a long time, I am looking forward, not back. The bridge to my future is sound. My new life settled into a comfortable rhythm, a well-designed system operating at peak efficiency. The daily walks, the volunteering, the quiet afternoons with a book and a perfect espresso, they became the rituals that defined my independence. I realized that for years my life had been structured around the needs and expectations of others, first as a husband and provider, which was a role I cherished, and then as a father, and finally as the caretaker of a house that had become more of a museum than a home. Now, my only obligation was to myself. It was an unfamiliar concept at first, but one I grew to embrace. I reconnected with old friends from my engineering firm, men I had lost touch with, amidst the fog of Helen's illness and my subsequent quiet grief. We started a monthly poker game, just like old times. Over cards and beer, I shared a sanitized version of my story. They saw it as a tactical triumph. "You always were 10 steps ahead on every project, Arthur." One of them, a man named George, chuckled. "Should have known you'd have a contingency plan for this too." Their perspective helped frame the events not as a family tragedy, but as a complex problem that required a logical, albeit ruthless, solution. The emotional sting began to fade, replaced by a sense of pragmatic satisfaction. The world of my daughter and her husband seemed to shrink further and further away. I would occasionally hear whispers through my cousin Mark. They had struggled financially. Tom had apparently been counting on a promotion at his sales job that didn't materialize, and their lifestyle, built on the expectation of my imminent financial demise, was unsustainable. They had to sell Sarah's expensive SUV. There was a quiet justice in that, a balancing of the universal ledger. I took no pleasure in their hardship, but I felt no sympathy either. They had made a calculated business decision to treat me as a disposable asset, and their venture had failed. Their loss was simply the cost of doing business. The real joy came from the scholarship fund. At the end of the first academic year, I received a handwritten letter from the inaugural recipient. She wrote about her classes, about the thrill of working in the university's structural engineering lab. She said the scholarship had allowed her to focus on her studies without the constant burden of financial worry. "Because of you and your late wife," she wrote, "I can build my future." I placed her letter on my desk, next to the picture of the Harrison Bridge. It was a tangible result, a load-bearing beam in the new structure of my life. This was my real inheritance. Not something I received, but something I gave. It was an investment in the future, in a way that a house passed down through a resentful bloodline could never be. My trip to Spain was even better than the one to France. I spent a month tracing the path of ancient Roman engineering, marveling at the aqueducts of Segovia and the bridges that still stood 2,000 years after their construction. These were structures built by people who understood permanence. They built for empires, for centuries. It put my own small family drama into perspective. My life was a tiny sliver of time, but what I did with it, the principles I chose to live by, mattered. I chose to live like those Roman engineers. Build with integrity, ensure the foundations are deep and strong, and create things that will outlast you. On my 70th birthday, I didn't have a big party. I invited my cousin Mark and my friend George over to my condo. We opened a bottle of excellent scotch, sat on the balcony, and watched the city lights flicker on. There were no strained family obligations, no forced smiles, no underlying tensions. It was just genuine companionship. Mark raised his glass. "To Arthur," he said, "the man who designed his own masterpiece of a life." I smiled. He was right. I had become the architect of my own peace, the project manager of my own contentment. I had taken a situation designed to break me and used it as the catalyst to build something stronger and more authentic in its place. The past was a blueprint of a failed project, one I had learned from and filed away. The future was an open design, full of possibilities, and for the first time, I felt I had all the right materials to build it. As time went on, the story of what I had done became a quiet legend in my small circle. It wasn't something I boasted about, but the simple fact of my comfortable, independent life was a testament to the choices I had made. The narrative Sarah had tried to write, of the confused, incompetent old man, had been utterly erased and replaced by the reality of a man fully in command of his faculties and his future. My poker nights with my old engineering colleagues continued, a reliable source of camaraderie. During one game, my friend George, while contemplating a difficult hand, looked at me and said, "You know, Arthur, the thing about your situation with your daughter, it's a classic case of miscalculating the load capacity." I chuckled. "How so?" "She put too much weight on your sentimentality," he said, tossing a chip into the pot. "She assumed your love for her, and for Helen's memory, would be a weakness she could exploit. She never calculated that your sense of self-preservation, your own structural integrity, was the stronger material." He was right. It was the perfect engineering analogy. They had banked on my emotional foundation being weak, susceptible to the pressures of guilt and obligation. They never imagined that my core was made of something more resilient. I had spent a lifetime analyzing stress points and failure risks in concrete and steel. It turned out the principles were transferable to life itself. The peace I had found was not a passive state. It was an active one, maintained by the boundaries I had erected. I had no contact with Sarah, and I had made it clear through my lawyer and my cousin that I desired none. It wasn't about punishing her further. It was about protecting my own well-being. My home was a sanctuary, and I would not allow the toxicity to seep back in. I focused outward, on the things I could build. The scholarship fund was thriving. I had made some shrewd investments, and the principal had grown, allowing the foundation to offer a second scholarship the following year. I met with the university's financial aid director, a warm and capable woman who shared stories of the students my gift was helping. They were ambitious, bright, and grateful. They were the children I was now investing in, a legacy of merit rather than blood. One day, while at a coffee shop near my condo, I had an unexpected encounter. A young woman approached my table hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Arthur Jennings?" I confirmed that I was. "I'm Amelia," she said, her eyes bright. "I'm the first Jennings scholar." I was momentarily stunned. I stood up and shook her hand. She was poised and articulate, radiating a quiet intelligence. We talked for nearly an hour. She told me about her dream of designing sustainable water systems. She asked me about my career, about the bridges I had built. The conversation was invigorating, a true meeting of minds between generations. As we were about to leave, she said something that struck me deeply. "Mr. Jennings, what you did, it's not just about the money. It's knowing that someone believes in you. It's like you built a foundation for me to stand on." A foundation. There was that word again. It was the theme of this new chapter of my life. I had torn down a failing structure built on deceit and entitlement, and in its place I was now helping to build dozens of new ones, strong foundations for the next generation of builders. When I returned to my quiet, orderly condo that afternoon, I felt a profound sense of rightness, of accounts being fully and finally settled. My life was my own. The assets I had spent a lifetime accumulating were being used for creation, not for funding a petty, materialistic fantasy. I had faced the ultimate stress test, and I had not broken. I had simply redesigned the project. The past was a closed book, a case study in failure analysis. The future was clear. I was a builder, and I still had a lot of building left to do.